The sky over the canyon had torn open. Wyatt Wales threw his shoulder against the warped door of the abandoned line shack, just as a wall of brown water roared past, swallowing the path he'd just been on. He stumbled inside, gasping. The sound of the flash flood a ravenous beast at his back. Rain hammered the tin roof like 1,000 tiny blacksmiths. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw her. She was sprawled on a rusted cot, a pale shape in the dark. He thought she was a corpse until a flicker of lightning illuminated the scene. Her dress, once fine silk, was shredded and stained dark with blood. An iron manacle, thick and cruel, chained her ankle to the cot's frame. Nailed to the wall above her was a soggy piece of paper, the ink running in black tears. He could make out only 2 words, Maddie Starr, and below it, stark and final, murder. He froze, the cold rain on his skin turning to ice. This wasn't shelter, it was a cage. And he had just locked himself inside with the bait. Then, a sound, softer than the rain but sharper than a gunshot, a low moan. Her eyes opened, finding his in the dark. The roar of the floodwater was a constant, hungry thing, but in the close, damp air of the shack, the loudest sound was the rasp of his own breathing. Her eyes, wide and dark, held his. They weren't pleading. They were the eyes of an animal caught in a trap, watching the hunter, trying to guess if the next move meant freedom or death. Wyatt's gaze flickered from her face to the cruel iron band around her ankle, then up to the word murder, bleeding ink on the wall. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to press himself into the far corner and wait for the sun, to let this be someone else's trouble. The world was full of trouble. He'd spent a lifetime learning to walk around it. He took a step back, the floorboards groaning under his heel. Her eyes followed him, but her expression didn't change. She didn't beg. The silence from her was more damning than any scream. He saw the raw red skin where the manacle had chafed her flesh raw. He smelled the iron tang of blood mixed with the scent of rain and rot. His jaw tightened. He could ride away in the morning, leave her for whoever put her here. He could tell himself it wasn't his business. He could live with that. He knew men who did, but the thought soured in his gut like bad whiskey. His gaze swept the shack's cluttered corners, landing on a length of rusted pry bar lying near a collapsed woodpile. It was heavy, meant for leverage, for breaking things. Without a word, he picked it up, the cold, pocked metal a dead weight in his hand. He turned back to her. For the first time, a flicker of something, fear or maybe hope, crossed her face. She pulled her leg back, a small reflexive motion, the chain clinking against the cot's frame. Wyatt didn't speak. Words were useless here. He knelt, the wet dirt of the floor soaking through the knee of his pants. He wedged the tip of the pry bar into a link of the chain, right near the padlock. He gave her one last look, a silent question. She held her breath. He gripped the bar with both hands, planted his feet, and threw his weight into it. The metal groaned, a high, protesting shriek. Nothing. He repositioned it, sweat beading on his brow, and pushed again. A loud crack echoed in the small space, sharper than thunder. The link warped, bent open just enough. The chain fell loose. His world, once as simple as surviving a storm, had just broken open with it. He had done more than free her. He had just shackled himself to her fate. The pry bar fell from Wyatt's hand, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy final clatter that seemed to sever the moment from everything that had come before it. The air in the shack was thick with the smell of wet earth, rust, and the lingering scent of her fear. Outside, the flood was a steady, grinding roar, a reminder that they were on an island in the middle of a drowned world. Maddie Starr watched him, her dark eyes tracking his every move. She didn't rub her freed ankle or cry out in relief. She simply sat, coiled and tense, a creature uncertain if one cage had just been exchanged for another. Her breath came in shallow, sharp little sips. Wyatt turned his back to her, a deliberate act of granting privacy. He walked to the warped door and peered through a crack in the wood. There was nothing to see but a churning brown torrent, logs and debris cartwheeling past in the violent current. They were going nowhere until the water fell. He was trapped with the woman, and with the word nailed to the wall above her head. Murder. The word pulsed in the gloom. He let out a slow breath and went to his saddlebags, slumped in a corner where he'd dropped them. He untied the leather straps with numb fingers, his mind a blank slate. He wasn't thinking about the law, or the men who'd chained her here. He was thinking only of the raw, bloody furrow on her ankle. He pulled out his canteen and a strip of cloth he used for cleaning his rifle. the cleanest thing he owned. When he turned back, she flinched. Her whole body went rigid as he took a step toward her. He stopped. He didn't say a word. He just held out the canteen, a simple offering. Her eyes darted from his face to the canteen and back again. For a long second, she did nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached out. Her fingers were cold as they brushed his. She took the canteen, her hands trembling so badly she had to use both to guide it to her lips. She drank, deep and desperate, the water spilling down her chin and onto the stained silk of her dress. When she was done, she lowered it, her gaze still locked on his. He gave a short, curt nod toward her leg. That ankle. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly from disuse. Instinctively, she tried to tuck her foot under her, a flash of pure terror in her eyes. The small movement sent a jolt of pain through her, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. Wyatt held up his hands, palms open, an old familiar gesture used to calm a spooked horse. "Just to clean it," he said, his voice level. "It'll fester otherwise." He knelt on the damp floor again, not too close, giving her the space to refuse. He placed the cloth on the edge of the cot and uncapped the canteen, pouring a little water onto it. He didn't move further. He waited. The decision was hers. The shack was filled only with the sound of the flood and her ragged breathing. Finally, after a silence that stretched for an eternity, she slowly, painfully, extended her leg toward him. It was the heaviest kind of trust, offered without a single guarantee. His hands, calloused and scarred from rope and iron, were surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with a patience that felt alien in the violent space. He worked methodically, his focus absolute, wiping away the dirt and the dried blood to reveal the angry red flesh beneath. He didn't look at her face, only at his task. This was a language he understood, not words, but work, fixing what was broken. He saw her shiver, a tremor that ran through her whole body, but she didn't pull away. When he finished, he looked at the paltry bandage. Not enough. Without hesitation, he reached for the hem of his own worn shirt and tore a long, clean strip from the bottom. The sound of ripping fabric was loud in the quiet. He wrapped the cloth around her ankle, securing it with a firm, simple knot. The bandage was stark white against her skin. His work done, he stood up and retreated. He didn't claim the cot. He didn't even stand near it. He walked to the far wall, slid down to the floor, and leaned his back against the rough-hewn planks. He tipped his hat forward, casting his face in shadow. He had given her the cot, the water, the bandage. Now, he gave her the distance. The silence returned, but it had changed. The sharp edge of terror had been replaced by a dull hum of uncertainty. She watched him from across the small room, a dark shape against a dark wall. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. The men who put her here had been loud, their cruelty a bonfire. This man's quiet was deeper, more unsettling. A long time passed. The roar of the flood outside seemed to soften, its fury abating. In the relative quiet, her voice, when it came, was a shock. It was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked. Why? Wyatt didn't move. He didn't lift his head. The brim of his hat hid his eyes. He thought of all the reasons. The right ones, the wrong ones. The ones he could say, and the ones he couldn't. He settled on the only one that felt true. Got tired of walking around it. He heard her shift on the cot, the rustle of straw. He didn't know if she understood. He wasn't sure he did either. But in the cold, damp dark of that shack, a fragile thread had been spun between them, not of trust, not yet, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. They were both survivors, marooned by a storm. And for now, that was enough. The sun broke weak and yellow through a bruised-looking sky. The roar of the flood had faded to a gurgle, leaving behind a world draped in a thick blanket of mud and silence. Wyatt woke with a start, the floorboards cold against his back. Across the small shack, Maddie was awake, sitting perfectly still on the cot, watching the sliver of light from the cracked door. She looked smaller in the daylight, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her eyes holding the deep, weary caution of a hunted animal. He got to his feet, his joints protesting. Without a word, he moved to his saddlebags and pulled out a piece of dried venison, hard as a boot heel. He broke it in two and held a piece out to her. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then took it. They ate in silence, the only sound the tough chew of the meat and the drip of water from the leaky roof. The fragile piece felt like a held breath. When he was done, he picked up his hat and went to the door, pulling it open. The air hit him first, cool and heavy with the smell of wet pine and decay. The path was gone, scoured away by the torrent, replaced by a slick, deep channel of muck. His horse, thankfully, stood patiently where he'd left it on a small rise, its coat matted with mud. As Wyatt made his way toward the animal, his boots sank into the soft earth and he saw it. A hoof print, sharp and clear in the mud, not 5 yards from the shack. It wasn't from his horse. This one was shod, the mark of a cavalry mount or a rider with money to spare. It was fresh. They had been watched. A cold dread trickled down his spine. He straightened up slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line, the rocky outcrops, the silent, watching wilderness. Nothing. He ran a hand over his horse's neck, his gaze never stopping its sweep of the horizon. He was halfway back to the shack when he saw the rider. The man came out of the trees to the west, not fast, but with a steady, purposeful gait that spoke of authority. He sat tall in a military saddle, his uniform a crisp blue against the drab landscape. As he drew closer, Wyatt could see the polished gleam of his boots and the brass buttons on his coat. He stopped his horse a respectable distance away, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. He had a clean-shaven, handsome face, but his eyes were like chips of blue ice, missing nothing. "Morning," the man said. His voice was calm, educated. "Lieutenant Ethan Call, U.S. Army. Didn't expect to find anyone out in this mess." Wyatt just nodded, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. "Got caught in the flood." Lieutenant Call's gaze flicked from Wyatt to the shack and back again. "Looking for shelter, I see. Dangerous place to be right now. We're tracking a fugitive. You seen anyone pass this way? A woman. Alone." Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He could feel her presence in the shack behind him, a weight on his back. This was it, the easy out. Tell the truth, collect the thanks, and walk away clean. He met the lieutenant's gaze. "Haven't seen a soul." The lie felt thick and clumsy in his mouth, but his voice came out steady, cold as a stone. Call watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, already damp from the air. He unfolded it. A wanted poster. Wyatt didn't have to get closer to see the name printed in stark black letters, Maddie Starr. The drawing was rough, but it was her. The dark eyes, the set of her jaw. Below it, the charges were laid bare. The murder of a federal marshal. A reward of $100. Enough to make a man rich or dead. She's considered armed and extremely dangerous, Call said, his eyes still locked on Wyatt's. Killed Marshal Kane near Santa Fe. If you're lying to me, son, you're obstructing justice. That's a hanging offense. I told you, Wyatt said, his voice flat. I ain't seen her. Call folded the poster and tucked it back into his coat. He gave a thin, unsatisfying smile. All right then, keep your eyes open. $100 is a lot of money for a woman's whereabouts. He tipped his hat slightly, wheeled his horse around and rode back the way he came, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had arrived. Wyatt stood frozen, the man's parting words echoing in the quiet. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The false hope lasted less than a minute. From the east, another sound. Not one horse, but several. A posse. These men were different. They were locals, hard-faced and grim, their clothes caked in mud, rifles held loosely across their saddles. The man at their head was big and slovenly, with a thick beard stained by tobacco and a mean glint in his eye. Wales, the man grunted, pulling his horse to a halt. It was Rooster Kane, a man who ran a small spread and a large dose of fear in the valley. What are you doing out here? Same as you, Rooster. Surveying the damage. Kane's eyes narrowed, scanning the shack. We're hunting. The Army's looking for that Star woman. Figure we'd lend a hand. Maybe claim that reward. You ain't seen her, have you? The lieutenant was just here, Wyatt said, letting a weary annoyance creep into his voice. He hooked a thumb in the direction Call had gone. He already asked, if a federal marshal couldn't find her, I doubt you will. The bluff landed. Kane chewed on it for a moment, his gaze flicking between his men. The thought of being second to the Army, of searching ground already covered by a professional, pricked his pride. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Wyatt's boot. Maybe, Kane sneered, but the Army ain't from around here. They don't know all the holes a snake can crawl into. His eyes bored into Wyatt, then shifted to the door of the shack one last time. We find out you're holding out on us, Wales. We find out you're keeping that reward money for yourself. This whole place will make a fine bonfire. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it snorted in protest. Let's ride, he barked to his men. Check the old canyon pass. They rode off, a jangle of bridles and muttered curses fading into the mud-soaked landscape. Wyatt didn't move until they were completely out of sight. The air was still. The sun was a little higher, but the world had shrunk to the size of the tiny, dilapidated shack behind him. The law was hunting her. The locals were hunting her. There was no help coming. There was nowhere to run. He turned and walked back inside, pulling the door shut. Maddie hadn't moved. She was still on the cot, but her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap. She had heard everything. He looked at her, at the raw ankle wrapped in a strip from his own shirt, at the terror simmering behind her unblinking eyes. He was no longer a man who had found trouble. He was the man standing between her and the gallows, and the shadow of that rope was long enough to fall over them both. The door swung shut, plunging the shack back into shadow. The silence left behind by Kane's posse was heavier, more menacing than their threats. Wyatt looked at Maddie. Her eyes were wide, but the terror in them was being forged into something harder, something like cold steel. There was no need for discussion. Staying was death. Running was a chance. He moved with a sudden, desperate economy. He grabbed his saddlebags, shoving the last of the venison inside. He checked the loads in his Colt, the metallic click of the cylinder turning loud in the small space. Maddie slid off the cot, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. She ignored the pain in her ankle, her movements stiff but resolute. She pulled the tattered remains of her dress tighter around herself, a useless gesture against the cold that was coming. "My horse is all we've got," Wyatt said, his voice low and tight. "He can carry two, but it'll be slow going through this muck. We head for the high rocks. They'll lose our trail there." She just nodded, her jaw set. He opened the door, and they stepped out into the raw afternoon. The world was a ruin of mud and tangled brush. He led the horse down from its small patch of dry ground, its hooves sucking at the wet earth. He swung himself into the saddle, then reached down a hand for her. She took it, and he pulled her up, settling her in front of him. Her body was rigid, a coil of fear and adrenaline pressed against his. He urged the horse forward, picking a slow, agonizing path through the mire. Every step was a gamble, the ground unstable and treacherous. The shack disappeared behind a stand of skeletal pines. They were exposed, a single dark shape moving across a scarred landscape. The only sound was the slurp of hooves and the ragged pattern of their breathing. The sun was a pale coin in the sky, offering no warmth, only light for their pursuers. They made it to the edge of the wash, where the ground began to firm up, sloping toward the stony hills that promised cover. Hope, thin and fragile, began to flicker in Wyatt's chest. Another 100 yards and they'd be in the rocks. The crack of the rifle shot was like a whip crack against the sky. It came from the ridge to their right. A puff of white smoke bloomed against the gray rock. The bullet tore through the air with a vicious hum, splintering the bark of a tree just ahead of them. The horse shied violently, screaming, nearly unseating them both. "Kane!" Wyatt snarled, kicking the horse into a desperate gallop. He circled back. Another shot. This one kicked up a geyser of mud right beside the horse's plunging hooves. Wyatt could see them now. 3 riders on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. Rooster Kane was in the middle, lowering his rifle to reload. They were pinned down, a perfect target on the open ground. Wyatt swerved the horse toward a shallow ditch bordered by a small cluster of boulders, the only cover in sight. "Hold on!" he yelled. They were halfway there when the third shot hit. It wasn't a sound Wyatt heard, but a feeling. A white-hot punch to his left shoulder that stole his breath and sent a wave of sickening fire down his arm. A grunt of pure agony was torn from his throat. His grip went slack on the reins. The world tilted, the sky and the mud swapping places in a dizzying blur. He was falling. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. The horse, panicked and riderless, bolted into the trees. For a moment, there was only the ringing in his ears and the searing pain that eclipsed everything. He rolled onto his back, gasping, and saw Maddie. She had been thrown clear, landing in the soft mud a few feet away. On the ridge, Kane let out a triumphant roar. "Got him! He's down!" The riders started down the slope, moving fast, eager to claim their prize. Wyatt fumbled for his Colt, his left arm useless, his fingers slick with blood. He got the gun free, his vision swimming. "Maddie," he rasped, the word tasting of blood and dirt. "Run! Get to the rocks! Go!" She stared at him, her face a mask of shock. Then she looked up at the advancing riders, their figures growing larger, more menacing, with every second. The terror returned to her eyes, raw and absolute. This was the moment she should break, should flee into the wilderness and save herself. But she didn't. Her gaze snapped back to him, to the dark stain spreading across his shirt, to the gun hanging loosely in his trembling hand. Something inside her shifted. The hunted animal found its teeth. "No," she whispered, the word fierce and sharp. Ignoring his protest, she scrambled to his side. She grabbed him under his good arm, her slight frame straining against his dead weight. "Get up," she commanded, her voice a raw cry. "Get up." Pain lanced through him as she hauled him to his feet. He staggered, leaning on her, his head spinning. Bullets whined past them, thudding into the earth around their feet. Kane and his men were closer now, close enough for Wyatt to see the greedy smiles on their faces. Maddie dragged him toward the boulders, her bare feet finding purchase in the slick mud. She was impossibly strong, fueled by a desperation that had finally boiled over into rage. They collapsed behind the largest rock, just as a spray of lead chipped fragments from its surface. Wyatt slumped against the cold stone, fighting to stay conscious. "You should have run," he gasped, his vision blurring at the edges. She didn't answer. She pried the Colt from his failing fingers. The heavy iron weapon looked alien in her small, shaking hands. She peered over the edge of the rock. The riders had dismounted, spreading out, advancing on foot, confident their prey was trapped. "He's hit bad, boys," Kane shouted, his voice echoing in the clearing. "No rush." "Let's finish this proper." Maddie's breath hitched. She was no gunslinger. She looked at the heavy pistol, then at Wyatt, whose eyes were starting to glaze over. His life was draining into the muddy ground beneath them. Her gaze swept their pathetic sanctuary, a few scattered rocks at the base of a steep, unstable scree slope. And then she saw it. Not a weapon, but a chance. Above them, precariously balanced on the slope, was a dead pine, its roots long ripped from the earth by the flood. It was wedged against a car-sized slab of loose rock, the only thing holding a small avalanche of stone and debris in place. Kane was less than 30 yards away, taking careful aim. "Come on out, Star. Just makes it worse for yourself." Maddie didn't answer. She laid Wyatt's gun down. She looked at him one last time, a silent promise in her eyes. Then she broke cover. She didn't run away from the riders. She ran sideways, scrambling up the first few feet of the loose, treacherous slope. "What the hell?" one of Kane's men yelled, surprised by the sudden, suicidal move. Kane swung his rifle toward her. "Get her!" But she was fast. She clawed her way up the shifting rock face, dirt and pebbles cascading around her. She reached the base of the dead pine. With a desperate sob of effort, she threw her shoulder against the trunk. It groaned, but held. Kane fired. The bullet struck the rock just inches from her head, showering her with stone dust. She didn't flinch. She set her feet, gathered every ounce of strength she had left, and shoved again. This time, the dead roots scraped against the slab. The entire slope seemed to groan. She pushed again, a raw scream tearing from her lungs, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. With a deep, cracking sound, the deadfall shifted. The slab of rock teetered for a heart-stopping second, then gave way. It started a chain reaction. A river of rock, mud, and splintered wood broke loose, thundering down the slope directly into the path of the advancing men. It wasn't an attack. It was the mountain itself coming down. The men yelled in panic, turning to run, but it was too late. The landslide swept over them, a chaotic roar of destruction that shook the very ground. It wasn't a clean kill. It was a brutal, elemental force that buried their greed under tons of rock and earth. Silence fell, absolute and profound, broken only by the trickle of loose pebbles. Maddie slid down the slope, landing in a heap beside the boulders. She was shaking, covered in grime, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. She crawled to Wyatt, her protector, her captor, the only person who had shown her a shred of kindness. He was still breathing, his eyes barely open. She took his face in her hands. Wyatt. His eyes fluttered, focusing on her. He had seen it all. He had seen the quiet, terrified woman become a force of nature. Without a word, she took his good arm, slung it over her shoulder, and began the slow, torturous work of dragging him away from the battlefield she had created, toward the shadows of the high rocks and an unknown future. The world had narrowed to the space of a single breath. A gasp for air, a grunt of pain, another step. Maddie's feet, bare and bleeding, slipped in the slick mud, but her grip on Wyatt did not loosen. He was a dead weight, his good arm slung over her shoulder, his boots dragging through the muck, leaving 2 deep furrows in the earth behind them. His blood, dark and warm, soaked the shoulder of her torn dress. Each step was a battle against his weight, against the screaming protest of her own muscles, against the crushing silence that had fallen over the clearing. The landslide had been a roar of finality. This was the quiet, agonizing work that came after. She didn't look back at the fresh grave of rock and timber she had made. Her eyes were fixed forward, scanning the terrain for shelter. The high rocks offered a maze of shadows and crevices. She hauled Wyatt toward a dark fissure between two towering monoliths of granite, a crack in the world barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Inside, the air was still and cold. It smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. She lowered him as gently as she could to the sandy floor, his head lolling back against the rock with a soft thud. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. "Maddie," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp. "Hush now," she whispered, her hands already working, tearing a wider strip from the hem of her ruined dress. His shirt was a write-off, a sodden rag of red and blue. She needed to see the wound, to stop the bleeding. She pulled the fabric away. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, a vicious, ugly hole. For a moment she felt a wave of nausea, of helplessness. She was no doctor. She had no tools, no medicine, nothing but her own trembling hands. She pressed the wadded cloth against the wound, front and back, applying pressure. He groaned, a deep guttural sound, and his body tensed. "Stay with me, Wyatt," she urged, her voice fierce. "You just stay with me." He was fading. She could see it in the gray pallor of his skin, the way his gaze kept drifting. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. Running was no longer an option. He couldn't ride, could barely stand. They were trapped here. And the landslide. It was loud. It was violent. It was a dinner bell for any curious party within 5 miles. Lieutenant Call was not a curious man. He was a methodical one. He would come to investigate the sound. He would find Kane's posse buried under half a mountain. He would find their tracks leading away from the carnage. He would follow. The realization settled in her gut, cold and heavy as a stone. They couldn't outrun him. They couldn't outfight him. Wyatt was down, and she had a single pistol with a few rounds left against the United States Army. It was an equation that only added up to death, their death. She looked at Wyatt, at the man who had knelt to clean her ankle, who had lied to a federal officer for her, who had taken a bullet meant for her. He had chained himself to her fate. Now the weight of that chain was dragging them both under. Her gaze fell on the Colt pistol lying in the dust beside him. It was heavy, dark, and deadly. But it wasn't the weapon she needed. The true weapon was the wanted poster, the lie printed on it. Murderer, armed and extremely dangerous. Lieutenant Call believed that. He expected a cornered animal, a killer. He expected brawn, not brains. A plan began to form, a desperate, terrifying gamble. It was a path that led back into the cage, not away from it. But it was the only path that led Wyatt out. She worked quickly, her panic replaced by a chilling clarity. She cleaned his wound as best she could with the last of the water from his canteen. She packed the holes with strips of her dress, creating a crude but tight pressure bandage. He mumbled protests, his good hand weakly trying to push her away, to tell her to go. She ignored him, her touch firm and resolute. "I'll be back," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. It was a lie, and they both knew it. His eyes cleared for a moment, a flash of understanding, of horror. "No, Maddie, don't." She pressed a finger to his lips. She took the nearly empty canteen and set it by his hand. Then she picked up the Colt. It felt cold and heavy, the weight of her decision made real in her palm. She stood up and walked out of the fissure into the pale afternoon light, not looking back. If she looked back, she would falter. Wyatt's horse was grazing nervously at the edge of the woods, drawn by the quiet. She approached it slowly, her movements calm, speaking to it in a low murmur. It let her take the reins. She didn't mount immediately. First, she walked the horse in a wide, deliberate circle, creating a clear set of tracks leading away from the landslide and past the fissure where Wyatt was hidden. Then she backtracked carefully, erasing her own footprints as she went, until she stood beside the horse at the start of the trail she had made. A trail for one rider, heading west. A trail for a fugitive. She swung herself into the saddle. For a moment she sat there, a lone woman on a stolen horse, holding a stolen gun, with a death sentence on her head. She took a deep breath and urged the horse into a steady trot, away from the only kindness she had known. She didn't have to ride for long. Less than an hour later, she saw him. Lieutenant Ethan Call and two other troopers, cresting a small hill. They saw her at the same time. They stopped, rifles coming to the ready. They were expecting a fight. Maddie pulled the horse to a halt. She didn't reach for the gun tucked into her waistband. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands high where he could see them. Call rode forward alone, his own pistol drawn, stopping 20 yards away. His blue eyes were narrowed, assessing the situation. He saw the lone woman, the familiar horse, the exhaustion and dirt on her face. "Maddie Starr," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "It's over." She swallowed, her throat dry as dust. This was the moment. Her performance had to be perfect. She let a look of cornered desperation flash across her face. "Where's your friend?" Call demanded. "The man from the shack." Maddie laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that shocked the soldiers. "Friend," she spat, infusing the word with all the contempt she could muster. "He wasn't my friend. He was a fool. Tried to take me in for your reward money." She watched Call's face. A flicker of something. He was listening. "He thought I was weak," she continued, her voice rising with false bravado. "He brought me to that shack, was going to hold me there until he could turn me over. But he made a mistake. He untied me." She let her gaze drop to the Colt at her waist. "And he underestimated me." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I took his gun. I took his horse. I left him bleeding in the mud back there. For all I know, the coyotes have gotten to him by now." She saw it, the shift in Call's eyes. He believed it, or he wanted to. It fit the narrative he already had in his head, the one on the poster, armed and extremely dangerous. A woman who killed a federal marshal wouldn't hesitate to shoot a simple rancher who got in her way. It explained the single rider, the stolen horse. It explained everything. As for those other men, she gestured vaguely back toward the landslide. They got in my way too. Call's expression hardened. He believed he was looking at a monster, and that was exactly what she needed. Slowly she reached down, took the Colt from her waistband, holding it by the barrel. She tossed it onto the ground between them. It landed with a soft thud in the dirt, a gesture of surrender. "I'm done running," she said, her voice dropping, sounding weary, defeated. Call holstered his own weapon. He gave a curt nod to one of his troopers. "Go find him," he ordered. "The rancher. See if he's still alive. Bring a medic if he is." He looked back at Maddie, his face a mask of cold, professional duty. He saw a murderer, a problem to be solved. He didn't see the woman who had just sacrificed her freedom for the man she was pretending to have killed. As the troopers cuffed her hands behind her back, the cold iron felt sickeningly familiar. But this time, it was different. This time, the chains were her choice. This was not a capture. It was a strategic retreat. She had lost the battle for her own freedom, but she had just won the war for Wyatt's life. As they led her away, she allowed herself one last look back at the high rocks, a silent farewell. She had outthought her enemy, using his own prejudice as her weapon. She had grown from a victim into the master of her own fate, even if that fate was a jail cell in Santa Fe. The first thing Wyatt was aware of was a boot nudging his leg. Not a kick, just a firm, insistent pressure. He blinked, the harsh light of the clearing a physical blow. A blue uniform swam into focus above him, the face of a young trooper, grim and professional. "Sir, can you hear me? The lieutenant sent me." Wyatt's entire world was a universe of pain centered in his shoulder, but Maddie's parting words were a bell ringing clearly through the fog. He was a fool. I left him bleeding in the mud. The story was his to hold or to break. The trooper's eyes were on him, waiting. In that moment, Wyatt understood the true weight of the chain she had forged between them. It wasn't iron. It was her life, and he held the key. She shot me," Wyatt rasped, the lie tasting like ash and blood in his mouth. He let his head fall back, a performance of utter defeat. "Took my horse. My gun." The trooper knelt, his expression shifting from suspicion to a kind of weary pity. "We got her, sir. She surrendered without a fight. The medic is on his way." He looked past Wyatt toward the raw mound of the landslide. "She claims she did that too. Buried Kane's whole crew. Hard to believe a little thing like her could cause all this." Wyatt closed his eyes, feigning unconsciousness. He didn't want the trooper to see the flicker of fierce pride that surged through him. A little thing like her. She was a flash flood. She was a landslide. She was the most dangerous person he had ever met, because she had made him care. Weeks bled into one another in a haze of antiseptic smells, and the starched white sheets of the Army infirmary at Fort Laramie. The surgeon, a stern man with a gentle touch, declared him lucky. The bullet had missed bone, and infection had not set in, but Wyatt felt no luck. Each day, he woke with the phantom weight of her pressed against him on the horse, the memory of her furious scream as she brought the mountain down. His healing was a countdown to her condemnation. The day he was finally allowed to walk the infirmary grounds, Lieutenant Call found him. The officer stood watching him, his blue eyes as cool and analytical as ever. "You're looking better, Wales," Call stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm heading out tomorrow, transporting the prisoner to Santa Fe for trial." Wyatt stopped, his hand tightening on the porch rail. "Trial for what?" "For shooting you. For the murder of 3 men by landslide. And of course for the original charge, the murder of Marshall Kane." Call watched him, his gaze sharp. "She confessed to it all. Didn't even put up a fight. Just said she did it and was done running." Wyatt's blood ran cold. She was sealing her own fate, building the walls of her cell higher and thicker with every lie she told to protect him. He thought of all the things he could say, the truth that would unravel her sacrifice and likely hang them both. He met the lieutenant's stare, his own face a hardened mask. "Then I guess justice is being served," Wyatt said, his voice flat and empty. He turned and walked away, feeling Call's eyes on his back. Every step was a betrayal, and every step was an act of faith. It took him another month to get his strength back, and every dollar he had to his name. He didn't ride to Santa Fe. He took a stagecoach, the jarring ride a constant, painful reminder of the shoulder she had saved. The town was a sprawling grid of adobe under a merciless sun. The jail was its heart, a squat, oppressive building that seemed to bake in the heat. He found her in a small, suffocating cell at the end of a dark corridor. The light from a single high window cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. She was thinner, paler, but her eyes, when they met his through the bars, were the same. They held the same deep, weary caution. He'd paid the guard double to be left alone. For a long time they just stood there, the silence a chasm between them. "You're alive," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "No thanks to you," he replied, the words rough. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. He stepped closer to the bars. "That was the stupidest, bravest damn thing I've ever seen." A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "You cut the chain, Wyatt. I just paid the debt." "There was no debt," he said, his voice cracking. He reached a hand through the bars, not touching her, just holding it in the space between them. "Maddie, why?" She looked at his hand, then back to his face. "You were the first person who didn't look at me like a reward to be collected or a body to be used. You washed the blood from my feet." Her voice broke on the last words. This was the moment. The wall he had spent a lifetime building crumbled to dust. "I had a sister," he said, the words coming out hard, as if pulled from deep in the earth. "Clara. She was younger than me. We were traveling with our folks, heading for Oregon. Bandits hit the wagon train. I hid. I was just a boy. I hid under a wagon and I listened. I listened to her scream." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a grief 30 years old. "When I found you in that shack, all I saw was her. All I heard was the quiet where her screaming used to be. I got tired of hiding, Maddie." She closed the distance between them, her small cold fingers finally wrapping around his through the bars. Her story came out in a torrent, a whisper of rage and pain. She told him about Marshall Kane, how he wasn't law, he was just a predator with a badge, how he and his deputies had jumped her family's claim, how they'd murdered her father in cold blood when he wouldn't sign it over. Kane had come for her last. She'd used her father's old hunting rifle. It wasn't murder. It was the last act of a girl trying to survive a massacre. He listened, his grip on her hand tightening until his knuckles were white. Her trauma mirrored his own. They were two halves of the same scarred coin, two survivors marked by a violence they didn't choose. The rescuer and the victim, the rancher and the fugitive, those were just costumes. Underneath, they were the same. "They've got no witnesses for what happened with Kane," Wyatt said, his voice low and intense, his mind racing. "Just your confession, and my testimony. I can say you were my captive, that you panicked, that the landslide was an accident." "And Marshall Kane?" she whispered, hopelessness clouding her eyes. "It's my word against a dead federal marshal's reputation. Then we make your word mean more." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the fugitive Maddie Starr, but the woman beneath. "What's your real name, the one your father gave you?" She hesitated, then spoke it softly, a name he'd never heard. "Libby," she said. "Libby Cooper." "Libby," he repeated, the name a vow. "I'm not leaving you here." He released her hand and took a step back from the bars, his entire being settled with a purpose that was as clear and bright as the desert sun. His loneliness, the guilt he'd carried like a shroud, it was gone. In its place was a conviction so powerful it was terrifying. "I'm getting you out. If it takes every dollar I have, if it takes the rest of my life, I am getting you out." She watched him, her eyes wide with a fragile, burgeoning hope. He had found his redemption not in running from his past, but in facing hers. And she, in this cold, dark cell, had found the one thing she thought had been buried with her family, a reason to trust again. He turned and walked down the corridor without looking back. But this time, there was no betrayal in the act. There was only a promise. He was the man who had cut her chains, and he would not let them build a gallows for her now. A year can wash the world clean. The sun that rose over their valley wasn't the hard, punishing glare of the high desert, but a soft gold that filtered through the leaves of cottonwood trees. It fell across the porch of the small cabin Wyatt was building, plank by careful plank. The air smelled of sawdust, rich soil, and the sweet scent of water from the creek that ran 50 yards from their door. The only sound was the rhythmic tap of his hammer, a sound of creation, not destruction. His shoulder ached sometimes, a dull throb that reminded him of the price of this piece. He paused, rolling the joint, and looked at his work. The cabin was sturdy, built from timber he'd felled and milled himself. Beside the door, a small garden was taking root. Tomatoes, beans, squash, a stubborn patch of life coaxed from the earth. This land, purchased with the last of his money and a small restitution from a territorial government embarrassed by its own corruption, was their sanctuary. The cabin door opened with a soft creak. Libby stood there, framed in the doorway. She was no longer the gaunt, haunted creature from the shack. The year had given her back the weight she'd lost, softened the sharp angles of her face, and extinguished the fire of fear in her eyes, leaving behind a warm, steady glow. She wore a simple cotton dress, and beneath it, her belly swelled with the gentle, unmistakable curve of new life. She carried a tin cup of water in one hand, holding it out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing. It was the same gesture from the shack, the simple offering of water, but a world of meaning had changed between then and now. The desperation was gone, replaced by an easy intimacy that needed no words. He drank, his eyes never leaving hers. "Cradle's almost done," he said, nodding toward a smaller, more intricate piece of woodwork sitting in the shade of the porch. The rockers were sanded smooth as river stone. "He's not due for 2 months, Wyatt," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "You'll have built him a rocking horse and a schoolhouse by the time he gets here." "A man ought to be prepared," he answered, the corner of his own mouth turning up. He set the cup down and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. "Letter came with the supply wagon this morning, from the lawyer in Santa Fe." Her smile faded slightly, the past still a shadow that could fall on the brightest day. "And? It's over. For good." He leaned against a porch post, his gaze fixed on the creek, its surface glittering in the sun. They concluded the investigation, found Marshall Kane's private ledger, hidden in the floorboards of his office, just like that stable hand said it would be. It listed a dozen claims he'd squeezed from families like yours. The names, the dates, the profits he shared with his deputies. It was all there. He looked back at her. "Your family's name was the first on the list. The territorial court posthumously convicted him. Your pardon is absolute. The name Libby Cooper is officially cleared of all wrongdoing." She closed her eyes, a long, slow breath escaping her lips. It was the sound of a burden, carried for what felt like a lifetime, finally being set down. "And your testimony?" she asked softly. "My testimony kept you from the gallows," he said, his voice low. "The ledger kept you from being a ghost. It gave you your name back." She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the new porch planks. She laid a hand on his chest, right over his heart. "It took everything you had, Wyatt. The money for the lawyer, for the investigator. You sold your father's watch." He covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady beat beneath his palm. He thought of the months after he'd left her in that cell, the relentless, grinding work of finding the truth. He'd hounded frightened townspeople, bribed clerks, and spent weeks searching the dusty, forgotten corners of Kane's life, until he found the one man who had seen Kane's deputies bury the lockbox and was scared enough of the marshal's ghost to tell Wyatt where. He had become the kind of man who didn't walk around trouble, but met it head-on, armed not with a gun, but with a stubborn, unyielding conviction. "It got me everything I ever wanted," he said, his voice thick with a truth so profound it almost buckled him. He looked from her face to the swell of her belly, where their child grew in the quiet safety they had built. This was his legacy, not a name carved on a gravestone, not a reputation in a dusty town, but this, a woman, a child, a home, a quiet patch of earth where life could flourish. Libby leaned her head against his good shoulder, the one that didn't bear the scar of their escape. They stood like that for a long time, watching the creek flow, listening to the whisper of the wind in the cottonwoods. The world outside this valley, with its posses and its prisons, its greed and its ghosts, felt 1,000,000 miles away. It couldn't touch them here. He remembered finding her in the shack, a broken thing chained in the dark, a life hanging by a thread. He remembered the sign above her head, meant as a curse, Maddie Starr, murderer. Now he looked at Libby Cooper, her face serene in the afternoon light, her body a vessel of hope. He thought of his sister, Clara, and the guilt he had carried like a stone in his gut for 30 years. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a stone. It was a foundation, the foundation upon which he had built this new life, this chance to protect, to nurture, to love. He gently placed his hand on her belly, feeling the faint fluttering movement from within. A life that would know nothing of chains or wanted posters. A life that would begin here, in this valley, born of a quiet love forged in the heart of a storm. They had survived. More than that, they had been transformed. He, the lonely, haunted man, was now a husband and a father-to-be. She, the hunted victim, was now the serene heart of their new world. Together they had created something far bigger than themselves. A legacy written not in ink or blood, but in the sturdy timber of a cabin and the promise of a child's laughter echoing by the water's edge. And so, the tale of Wyatt Wales and Libby Cooper fades into the valley, leaving behind the whisper of the creek and the echo of a hammer building a future. Their story proves that even in the harshest lands, where survival is etched in grit and gunpowder, the most powerful force isn't the bullet, but the bond between two souls who refuse to break. A life isn't just saved with a gun. It's built, plank by plank, with a promise. These are the kinds of powerful histories we live to uncover here at Wild Old West Memories. If you believe that true courage is measured by the sacrifices we make for others, then hitch your wagon to our channel and subscribe for more tales of quiet bravery and love that defies the odds. Let us know in the comments below what you think was the truest test of their bond. We read every one. Thanks for riding with us.